Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
Sarah Ponsonby's epitaph begins. She did not long survive her beloved companion, Lady Eleanor Butler, with whom she had lived in the valley for more than half a century of uninterrupted friendship. Sarah and Eleanor, colloquially known as the Ladies of Llangollen, lived together in North Wales for 51 years in a cottage that they renovated and designed to suit their tastes, on an estate where they built gravel footpaths wending through perfectly lush gardens planted with all manner of shrubs, flowers, fruit trees and bushes, and vegetables. They embraced the rural retirement so admired and extolled by 18th century philosophers, poets, and artists, and presented their domestic arrangement as the rare but mostly acceptable romantic friendship written about in novels and poems.
The inscription on Sarah Ponsonby's tomb is no accident. By framing her beloved as a friend, she preserved the public image of the Ladies of Llangollen as chaste, just two passionate women joined in intellectual pursuits and a comfortable country retirement. And perhaps they were just friends. Well, we have a remarkable archive of their own writings, the writings of others who observed them, and the writings of yet others who suspected something more sexual was afoot. We can't say for certain what level of intimacy Sarah and Eleanor shared. But no matter the specific details of their sexual or asexual life together, there's no denying that the life they built together defied expected and accepted gender and sexual norms for the time period. The Ladies of Llangollen were a queer couple who dedicated their lives to one another and to the home they built and shared in North Wales. And this month, we're lifting up stories of queer and trans folks in history, beginning with these two reclusive, but bizarrely public, Irish women who eloped to Wales together. I'm Avril Earls.
And I'm Sarah Hanley Cousins.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
We are so thankful for all of our Patreon supporters, especially our auger and excavator level patrons, Carl, Alyssa, Maria, Colin, Denise, Edward, Jesse, Judy, Karen, Lauren, Lisa, Megan, and Susan. We cannot thank you enough. Listener, if you enjoy what we do here, but you aren't yet a patron of this show, it is easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
As always, the work we do on this podcast is built on the excellent scholarship of other historians. Today's episode draws heavily from the most recent works on the ladies, specifically Natalie Reynolds' article on the peculiarities of their cottage ornée style, and Fiona Bride-Oak's examination of the ladies within the context of gender and sexuality in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as well as less recently the first co-biography of the ladies, which was written by Elizabeth Maver in 1971. Bride-Oak in particular did a lot of heavy lifting to challenge the narrow ways that scholars have, since the 1970s, framed the ladies' relationship. Typically, scholars have forced the ladies into one of two boxes, either as a romantic and chaste friendship or as a butch femme lesbian prototype. In truth, it's hard to so neatly categorize the ladies, and in overemphasizing how we might define them, scholars have neglected and missed opportunities to explore what the ladies' extraordinary life together in North Wales can tell us about the world in which they lived. I'm not doing any theoretical work in this episode. I think simply acknowledging the queerness broadly conceived of their life together is sufficient, but I am probably replicating this sort of problem of over-focusing on their relationship because there's a reason for that, right? The series is a celebration of the publication of my solo-authored book, Love in the Lab, a social biography of same-sex desire in Ireland, 1922 to 72. Which comes out on June 20th and is available now for pre-order. It's Pride Month in the US, so well-timed on the part of my publisher, and I'm really proud of this book and the work I've done to uncover the stories of queer working and middle-class men of Dublin. When we were talking over topics for this series, though, I wanted to tell some of the stories that are conspicuously absent in my book, namely queer Irish women. Ireland has a distinct lesbian history problem in that historians, myself included, have done so very little on queer Irish women. The Ladies of Llangollen are some of the only queer Irish women for whom there is a good bit of scholarship. So lacking any more developed options, I decided to learn a bit more about these famous ladies and bring their story to you. I hope you'll dig deeper with Bride Oak's book, which is theory heavy in the first few chapters, but then really gets interesting around chapter 3. And of course, order a copy of my book, Love and the Laugh.
As the story goes, Sarah Ponsonby and Eleanor Butler eloped in 1778. According to Fiona Brideoak and Elizabeth Maver, it isn't just a story. There's quite the deep archive evidencing the dramatics of the ladies' efforts to run away together.
Both Ponsonby and Butler came from well-established Irish families. The Ponsonbys were of the Protestant ascendancy, meaning they arrived in Ireland with the Cromwellian conquest of 1649 to 53, and Cromwell granted her ancestors land in Kilkenny. The Butlers were Catholic nobility, having arrived in Ireland with King John in 1185, and at Eleanor's birth they held the seat of the Duke of Ormond at Kilkenny Castle. I've seen historians describe both the Ponsonbys and the Butlers as newcomers, which tells you a great deal about the politics of indigeneity, land, and identity in Ireland, which persisted well after Irish independence from Britain in 1921 into the 1970s, though it is less common today.
Eleanor Butler was born in 1739 in France. While her older sisters were boarded in Paris with the Blue Nuns, Eleanor was sent to an English Benedictine house at Cambrai. Though the Benedictines were not as fashionable as the Blue Nuns, Eleanor received an excellent education, was fluent in French, and well-read in literature, history, and philosophy. Eleanor refused to marry, but managed for years to evade her mother's determination to send her to either a convent or to a husband. Caroline Hamilton, who was Sarah's relative, described Butler as, quote, masculine, satirical, and, at the age of 29, awkwardly unmatched. Unsurprisingly, Sarah Ponsonby saw the much older Eleanor differently, and, according to historian Elizabeth Maver, Sarah described Eleanor as, quote, uncommonly handsome.
Eleanor and Sarah met when the former was 29 and the latter a 13-year-old student at Mrs. Park's boarding school. Yes, cringy and gross by today's standards, we know. Sarah's guardian, Lady Betty Fones, had asked Eleanor's mother to watch over Sarah's progress at the boarding school, and Eleanor had taken on that task. Eleanor enjoyed instructing Sarah in English literature, and their friendship grew through correspondence over the next 6 years.
Sarah Ponsonby was born in 1755. Her mother died when she was 3, and her father when she was 7. Orphaned, her guardians sent her to boarding school. In contrast to Eleanor Butler, Sarah was described by a family member, Caroline Hamilton, as slight and good-looking.
As a side note, this gendered language for describing the two and their physical appearance would ultimately be the fodder for scholars to categorize them as a butch femme couple, a reductive but oft-used concept in reclamation LGBT history. In other words, when scholars identify people in the past who had relationships with people who seem to be of the same gender and then claim them as gay, bi, or lesbian. This practice of history was important during the lesbian and gay rights movement of the 1960s and 70s because it was proof that gay and lesbian people have always existed. And to some extent, that is true because there were same-sex desiring people at all times, in all places around the world throughout history. But they didn't have or use words like gay or lesbian to self-identify or mark their socio-political roles. So it's important to sort of tease those nuances out.
Right. Little is known about their early relationship or intimacy other than that they met when Sarah was a student and that they wrote to one another regularly in the years that followed. In May 1773, when she was 18, Sarah left Mrs. Park's school to live with Lady Betty and Sir William Fones. Soon after, she started writing to friends about Sir William's unwanted sexual advances. At the same time, Eleanor's mother had, by then, resolved to send her to a convent. Mrs. Butler couldn't deal with having a 34-year-old spinster daughter and a recently converted son. Eleanor's brother had converted to Protestantism to consolidate his assets and station in the UK because this was a time when the penal laws were still preventing Catholics from serving in Parliament, inheriting undivided land, and other things. So since she couldn't pull him back to Catholicism, Mrs. Butler decided the best thing for the family and for her unmarried daughter was to make a nun of her.
From at least 1777, Eleanor and Sarah started making a plan via their correspondence to elope to England and live there together. After a year of planning, they made the attempt. On March 30th, 1778, Sarah allegedly left her guardian's house via window, and the two dressed in, quote, men's clothes, with Eleanor carrying a pistol, and headed for Waterford to catch a boat to Wales. They were, without much trouble, caught by Lady Betty and Butler's brother-in-law, Morgan Kavanagh, a day later. Lady Betty wrote upon their discovered escape to her friend Mrs. Goddard, quote, "My dear Mrs. Goddard, I can't paint our distress. My dear Sally leapt out of a window last night and is gone off. We learn Miss Butler of the Kilkenny Castle is with her. I can say no more. Help me if you can. We are in the utmost distress, and I'm sure you pity us. God bless you. Ever yours, E.F." Fiona Brydoak reads the suggestion of a sexual open secret in this hastily scrawled note, particularly because, after mentioning that Sarah went off with Eleanor, Lady Betty could, quote, say no more. As Brydoak suggests, quote, Butler and Ponsonby's relationship was characterized by the unspoken, yet palpably present threat of sexual transgression, which is only held at bay by the most active of cognitive refusals.
Kavanagh and Lady Betty forcibly separated Sarah and Eleanor. Sarah fell ill with a fever and was confined for a few days. Lady Betty wanted to blame the elder Eleanor and was pleased when news came that the Butlers planned to send their daughter to a convent in France. But Sarah insisted that the decision to abscond had been mutual. Though she'd been 13 when they met, by 1778, Sarah was 23 and strong in her convictions and love for Eleanor.
Lady Betty was, unsurprisingly, concerned about how romantic the friendship had grown between Eleanor and Sarah. The suggestion that the two wanted more than chaste friendship from one another was apparently widespread gossip. Lady Betty wrote to Mrs. Goddard, quote, "I hear they say these two friends must not live together. I can't help thinking as they do."
Despite her concerns, in the weeks after their first absconding attempt, Lady Betty allowed Butler and Ponsonby to spend enough time together for the two to make another plan to elope. Eleanor fled her brother-in-law's house and was able to hide in Sarah's cupboard with the help of Sarah's maid, Mary Carroll, for 3 days. Lady Betty must have seen the determination in the two to be together because at that point she and her husband wrote to the Butlers seeking resolution. The Butlers stayed firm on their plan to send Eleanor to a convent for 10 days before finally giving in. On April 28th, Butler's father sent his solicitor, quote, to make provision for the ladies to depart together. Sir William tried to convince them to stay in Ireland, promising that his advances were, quote, not meant as she understood it, and to double her annuity if she did, but she did not.
Mrs. Goddard, who'd been involved in the drama through her friendship with the family, said that she attempted to counsel Sarah against the plan, writing, quote, I spoke to her with harshness and freedom, said Butler had a debauched mind, no ingredients for friendship that ought to be founded on virtue, end quote. Sarah responded that she intended to, quote, live and die with Miss Butler, end quote. And that she did.
On May 4th, 1778, the ladies, along with Sarah's devoted servant Mary Carroll, left Woodstock. 4 days later, they boarded a ship in Waterford and landed in Wales on May 9th, 1778. They would never return to Ireland. Sarah chronicled their month-long tour of the Welsh countryside in her journal, which she titled An Account of a Journey in Wales, formed in May 1778 by two fugitive ladies and dedicated to her most tenderly beloved companion by the author. Oh, that's so cute.
I know.
Shrewdly, they'd selected Wales as their destination for a number of timely reasons. At the time, North Wales was the picturesque spot for tourists, especially nobles and elites like those in their social circles. Llangollen, where they'd ultimately settle, was on the Holyhead Road, the most traveled path from England to Ireland, which made it a popular resting place. The Llangollen Valley was, as Nicole Reynolds notes, fashionably rustic, quote, sufficiently remote and isolated from urban vice, yet still connected to the larger world.
About a month into their travels, Sir William died, and Lady Betty followed him just 3 weeks later. Without further guarantees of funds then from the Phoneses, Sarah and Eleanor took lodgings in Llangollen, which was, quote, a small and poor town where the refined lover of picturesque scenes, the sentimental or the romantic can give a fuller indulgence to his inclination, end quote. The next year, they moved into a 5-room, 2-story cottage on 4 acres of land, which they rented for a little under £23 a year and named Plas Newida, or New Hall in Welsh.
They lived together in Llangollen for 51 years. They broke into the local gentry scene through friendship with Anne Hill Trevor, Lady Dungannon and grandmother of the future Duke of Wellington. She helped them to make connections with the various dignitaries of North Wales. They hosted dinners as well as tourists, which facilitated many of the donations that rounded out their annuities from family members and, later, the government. Their income was a combination of annuities and what they earned by selling hay, potatoes, and barley from their farm. For the first few years, they received a £200 annuity from Butler's father and £80 from Lady Betty's daughter, which was what they considered poverty, and was, in comparison with most of the other landed gentry and nobles they hobnobbed with, but was considerably more than their working-class neighbors in Llangollen. They and their staff, generally between 1 and 10 servants, grew a good deal of their food on the 4 acres, raised chickens and cows, and worked with locals to provide their meat, soap, and other needs. It reminds me of how, like, in Jane Austen novels, somebody has always, like, lost their fortune and is now in living in horrible poverty, but, like, they're still living in a manor house with 10 servants, right?
Yes, it's absurd. I think the cast of characters who rounded out their little homestead are worth mentioning. Their constant servant was, of course, Mary Carroll, who traveled with them in May in 1778 from Waterford to Wales, and stayed with them for the rest of their collective lives. She was almost certainly a friend to the ladies more than a servant by the end of their lives. According to the editor of one of Eleanor's journals, Mary's, quote, dignified social standing may be assumed because the ladies paid for her hair powder. They employed another 5 servants at various times. Molly Jones, who worked in the kitchen, though she was discharged, reinstated, discharged again when she got, quote, the itch, and reinstated once cured. Gwendolen was a housemaid who was, quote, according to the ladies, a pattern for all who followed. Pegeen was a, quote, indispensable daily and maid of all work, and Edward Perry, a footman, who was eventually found to be too expensive, and after firing him, the ladies only employed women for indoor work. The ladies also paid someone they just called the Irishwoman, or IW, who was their personal postwoman and trusted messenger. They employed a rotating and much abused gardening staff who saw to the acres of rose gardens, topiaries, and other growing things. Only a, quote, Simon found longevity in the ladies' employ.
In addition to the human staff that kept Plas Newida running, the ladies kept a small menagerie of pets. They nearly always had at least one cow, first Margaret, then Glory, Linda, who walked all the way from Bristol to Plas Newida, Primrose, and Beauty, whom Elizabeth Maver, an editor of the collection of Butler's journals, says was, quote, perhaps the most loved of all. They usually had a dog or two. Flirt, their first dog at Llangollen. Rover was her son. Bess and Gypsy, her daughters. Sappho.
Heyo.
And Phyllis, who had belonged to Lady Dungannon, who the ladies took in because Lady Dungannon was not permitted to take him when she retired to Hampton Court. Their cats included Tatters, who lived to be an astonishing 18, Tom, Babette, Muff, who was sadly lost in a snowdrift, Brandy, and Jillian. I love all of them.
I know.
Sappho and
so
Phyllis.
Good.
Get out of here with your cat names.
Those
are the dogs.
Great
I'm sorry.
Names.
Those are
almost
dog
as good
names.
as Vinegar Tom. I don't know.
Almost
TBD.
as good.
TBD. The ladies, with all these mouths to feed and salaries to pay, not to mention some expensive tastes, struggled to live on less than £300 a year, which was made worse in 1783 when Butler's father died and they lost most of their income. The next year, Eleanor's brother John granted them a £200 annuity and a gift of £500, which helped them pay off some considerable debts. Remarkably, they had several family members petition to have them placed on civil lists, which are like official government pensions. First of Ireland, Butler, by way of her friend, Lady Frances Douglas, for a £100 a year civil list income after 1787. And then England, Ponsonby, by way of the Duke of Wellington, their neighbor's grandson, as you know, for £200 a year in 1829. The civil list funds did not always pay out on time or for several years in a row at all, but between those remarkable string pullings and the semi-regular gifts from family members and visitors and the modest income they earned from what they farmed, the two were able to live fairly comfortably in Wales for most of their lives.
Elizabeth Maver notes the precociousness of the ladies, who made friends of enemies and enemies of friends with a kind of comical regularity. The Barrett sisters, who were, quote, deep and intense friends of the ladies, for example, fell out with the ladies when they parked their carriage at the Hand Inn when the ladies were conducting a vendetta against the proprietor. Even Lady Dungannon, who was essential in making introductions to Ponsonby and Butler to the local dignitaries and landed gentry, and most significantly to her grandson Arthur Wellesley, is described as, quote, yet another Irish friend. She was the Duke of Wellington's grandmother, spendthrift, eccentric, and on occasion exceedingly tedious. See also enemies.
They had a series of feuds with proprietors and workers from the town, including Mr. Edwards of the Hand Inn, Dons the tailor, quote, frequently unable to measure up to the exacting standards of the ladies in the matter of riding habits, but pleased sufficiently to be retained, end quote, and various, quote, joiners, plasterers, apothecaries, odd job men, gardeners, sightseers, and, in particular, chimney sweeps.
Arr.
Though some targets of their ire were more deserving, like her brother and sister-in-law, the Lord and Lady Ormond, who Eleanor maintained had cheated her out of her portion of the inheritance when their father died, many of these fallings out were undoubtedly affectations of two women who were cultivating an air of eccentricity and oddity about them. Eleanor's journal entries are humorous, filled with equal parts genuine delight and hyperbole regarding the beautiful place in which they lived and the people they encountered. But always, throughout her writings, she speaks reverently and lovingly of Sarah, a.k.a. Sally, a.k.a. my beloved.
For example, May 7th, 1784, my beloved and I went to walk in the fields at Pegwern.
January 5th, 1788. My beloved and I went the home circuit, fed Margaret the cow, who followed us from the pails to the melon ground door. Bought a whip from Davies the saddler, reading stern to my Sally, she netting a purse.
April 18th, 1790. Planted Scotch fir. Sent for Evan the clog maker to water them. Then my beloved and I went to the quarry and planted 7 Scotch fir there. Then we took the most delicious walk behind Pen y Coed. Returned over the Penward Road, the country superb.
April 21st, 1790. My beloved and I ran the home circuit, enjoying the rain.
May 24th, 1799. My better half and I went to Llantysilio Church. My beloved and I went to prayers in the village, spoke to Ned of the mill.
As Patricia Hampel notes, though the ladies allowed and even invited people into their home and grounds, if they'd had a choice, they'd probably have eschewed most company. But needs must and all that. Notably, for the most part, they themselves rarely left home, broadly speaking. They took regular walks around their property, following a number of preferred paths through gardens, fields, the woods, over the stream that ran through the property, and into town. They spent rainy days reading in the library, or, in the early years, decorating rooms in their house. Butler's journals reflect the quaint, restful life that a, quote, rural retirement was supposed to produce. She represents herself and her beloved Sally as aloof, educated interlopers in an amusingly provincial countryside.
For example, on Thursday, January 1st, 1789, quote, Jeanette, the reputed witch of the village, brought us for a New Year's gift a large parcel of apples tied up in a neat white napkin. I met her as she was coming in with her gift. She insisted on kissing my hand, a compliment I could well have excused, but could not avoid for fear of giving her pain. I think my hands feel chilled and numbed since. Not to cross this witch, Butler gave Jeanette 1 shilling for her gift. But most days, it was just her and Sarah, fully appreciative of the peace and quiet afforded to them by their idyllic little slice of Welsh heaven. Of course, Mary and likely some other servants were there too, but those weren't particularly important details beyond the wages the ladies paid them. Hampel says, quote, the retired life was the cloistered life, secular nuns.
Place Nuita, the cottage, was itself essential to the virtuous retirement that the two created for themselves in the countryside. Cottagecore was as popular in the 18th century as it is today. Artists and poets lauded it for the presumed return to a simpler life, away from the follies and vicissitudes of city life, where rural virtues like hard work, happy leisure, harmony with nature, hospitality, moderation, filial affection, conjugal felicity, and of course, sexual chastity persevered. We see this kind of veneration of the rural in Marissa's work on wet nursing as well. Elite families typically preferred country wet nurses because they believed women who came up from the country were healthier, more moral, and uncorrupted by the vices of the city. If I'm not mistaken, a number of the young women that Marissa is writing about in her book pass themselves off as country girls in an effort to gain employment and sometimes even garnish a better wage for their body work.
But of course, most of the elite of British and Irish society weren't interested in living in the truly humble laborer's cottage, just like cottagecore is more of an aesthetic and hobby than it is an actual lifestyle, with social media influencers curating a vision of their quote-unquote rustic life to promote tradwifery or conservative values and or their Amazon affiliates list, rather than the necessity of doing things by hand because you have to. Some bought or built truly basic cottages called rustic, primitive, or Old English style, where they escaped on weekends. Men and women like Ponsonby and Butler bought cottages and then reformed them into something else entirely, the cottage ornée, decorated and refurbished and expanded with Gothic, Chinese, Italian, Indian, or Egyptian motifs.
Among the ladies' more intriguing pursuits was the extensive renovations and additions they made to their home in Llangollen, transforming the, quote, low-roofed cot, as William Wordsworth described it in an 1824 poem, into this cottage ornée. On the exterior, the ladies collected ornate oak carvings from pieces of furniture and church fittings, which they arranged in a sort of patchwork around the doors and windows of the first floor. Many of those carvings were gifts from visitors. The carvings ranged in age from the medieval to the Baroque. The ladies also updated many of the windows with stained glass, and above the first floor, the exterior was decorated in a Gothic-style black and white trim and carvings. For the interior, Ponsonby and Butler installed a sizable Gothic library, somewhat controversially, as libraries in the 18th century were almost exclusively masculine spaces, and where they spent many a day reading together and discussing their literary finds. Their entry hall included Baroque oak paneling, and they entertained guests in their carefully and Gothically decorated parlor. The Place Nuita grounds ranged from formal parterre and rose gardens to beautiful woodland and dell areas where the Cwflimen, or fast-flowing one, stream, all of this set against the backdrop of the beautiful Welsh hills.
The house was central to their cultural capital. In keeping with a growing tourism industry centered around cottage and estate tours, the ladies allowed all manner of visitors to tour the grounds and interior, or at least the bottom floor, of Place Nuita. Mary Carroll, their live-in servant, gave tours of the region's, quote, dignitaries and first families, English and foreign aristocracy, members of parliament, rank and file, middle-class tourists, and groups of peasants, and reportedly earned a considerable salary for her trouble. Though they might turn some away, depending on their mood and need, the ladies utilized the public display of their home and domesticity to maintain their rural retirement. The ladies created handmade crafts to gift to particularly generous benefactors, like watercolor renderings of Place Nuita and an architectural rendering of the ground floor, and copies of garden inscriptions. They were shrewd, possibly also genuine, in their deployment of the cottage and serving their life there. They also invited the assessment of these visitors, who obliged, publishing reviews far and wide, from the romantic poets Anna Seward and William Wordsworth to lesser-known writers like Reverend Evans. As Reynolds notes, there were many contributors to the ladies' fame and the fame of Place Nuita. Newspapers and other periodicals published engravings of the cottage, as well as sensationalized accounts of the ladies' elopement and notices of their most recent activities. Not all attention was wanted, however, and could even be dangerous.
In 1790, for example, London's General Evening Post published an article about the ladies. I'm going to quote a big chunk from here. Miss Butler and Miss Ponsonby have retired from society to a certain Welsh vale. Both ladies are daughters of the great Irish families whose names they retain. Miss Butler, who is of the Ormond family, had several offers of marriage, all of which she rejected. Miss Ponsonby, her particular friend and companion, was supposed to be the bar to all matrimonial union. It was thought proper to separate them, and Miss Butler was confined. The two ladies, however, found means to elope together. Being soon overtaken, they were each brought back to their respective relations. Many attempts were renewed to draw Miss Butler into marriage, but upon her solemnly and repeatedly declaring that nothing could induce her to wed anyone, her parents ceased to persecute her by any more offers. Not many months after, the ladies concerted and executed a fresh elopement, each having a small sum with them, and having been allowed a trifling income. The place of the retreat was confined to a female servant of the Butler family, who was sworn to secrecy as to the place of their retirement. She was only able to say that they were well and safe, and hoped that their friends would be without further enquiry, continue their annuities, which has not only been done, but increased. Miss Butler is tall and masculine. She wears always a riding habit, hangs her hat with the air of a sportsman in the hall, and appears in all respects as a young man, if we except the petticoats, which she still retains. Miss Ponsonby, on the contrary, is polite and effeminate, fair and beautiful. They live in elegance, neatness, and taste. Two females are their only servants. Miss Ponsonby does the duties and honors of the house, while Miss Butler superintends the grounds, the gardens, and the rest of the grounds.
This newspaper article, which distilled the couple down into recognizable gendered roles, did not actually reflect the reality of their shared household as described in Sarah's letters to friends and family or in Eleanor's nearly daily journaling. Recognizing the danger of the invectives in the story, the ladies consulted Sir Edmund Burke about how to go about suing for libel. The article, after all, suggested that Eleanor was parading as a man, which, if allowed to stand, could get her into legal trouble and bring unwanted violence down on their household. And they thought they ought to pursue a legal suit to challenge the paper's representations of them. Burke counseled them not to pursue a libel case and wrote a response to the paper condemning the unsubstantiated depiction of the ladies.
By 1790, Place Nuita was well known locally and throughout the United Kingdom. The ladies had taken great care to avoid the kinds of negative press invoked in the General Evening Post by opening their home to visitors to show, literally, that they had nothing to hide. Their efforts to control the narrative were largely successful. Following Burke's recommendation, they canceled their subscription to that paper and put it behind them. They continued to host visitors and allowed tourists to move through their home and grounds. They walked that fine line between outlandish and eccentric and dangerous and interesting.
In addition to regularly entertaining the local gentry and nobility, their home became a stopover for all kinds of people. Though they never returned to Ireland, Irish family members, friends, and notables visited the ladies frequently. Because they fashioned themselves in this very public way as a household where Irish parliamentarians and emerging artists and writers and English nobility spent time, there is a quite impressive array of the ladies of Llangollen. Many of those accounts are also penned by the ladies themselves. But many more are correspondences, poems, stories, and journals of other people's observations of their home, their relationship, and their public personas. Notably, as Bride Oak writes, there are many of their contemporaries and family members who were concerned about the potential of, quote, debauchery and, quote, perversity of the ladies' relationship. But, as Nicole Reynolds points out, the ladies worked very hard to cultivate a public perception of their relationship as the coveted female romantic friendship, a concept that had emerged in the 18th century to, quote, describe a passionate relationship between two women, a union grounded in shared intellectual pursuits, intensified through letters, and articulated through tropes of sensibility, the pastoral, and the physical, though chastely rendered, intimacy. The female romantic friendship was both celebrated and notorious because it invited resistance to the traditional paths for women of Ponsonby and Butler's station.
How the ladies chose to present themselves to the world, as captured in the epitaph on Sarah's tombstone, is significant. When they were in control of the narrative, they defined themselves within the narrower, acceptable terms of romantic friendship. And undoubtedly, there were many elements of the 18th century framework of romantic friendship within their relationship. They were known for a shared passion for literature, which many scholars suggest is what drew them together in the first place at Mrs. Park's school. They wrote to each other throughout the years before they eloped, and continued to write about one another with passion and fondness. And they cultivated a warm domesticity in their sensible, though increasingly ornate, country home. They both defied heteronormative expectations of the era and conformed, in many ways, to the gendered expectations of women in their social standing.
But their sexual identities were, during their lifetimes, and are still a matter of intense debate and scrutiny, to the detriment, as Bride Oak and Reynolds note, of considering them as cultural icons of the era. The debate over their sexuality has, in some ways, obscured any other consideration of the ladies. We're replicating that a bit with this episode because their queerness is what is most interesting to us, right? To Averill as a scholar of Irish sexuality. The ladies were heralded as the textbook case of female romantic friendship by scholars of the 1970s and 1980s, particularly Elizabeth Maver and Lillian Faderman, and then reclaimed by lesbian historians in the 1990s and 2000s as early archetypes of a butch femme couple.
In her book, Fiona Bride Oak insists that assigning the ladies to one model or the other comes at the cost of understanding the true fluidity and nebulousness of female sexuality in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Perhaps unusefully, the ladies are often compared to, for example, Anne Lister, who left coded but explicit diaries about her sexual experiences with other women. The ladies did not leave such overt evidence of their own, but Bride Oak's own reading of the perception of the relationship, particularly the perception that Lady Betty had of the two, suggests that the two had a physical and sexual relationship. Reynolds rightly points out that in many ways, the did they, didn't they question doesn't matter, because the ladies themselves wanted people to see them as romantic friends. Within that trope, their rural retirement at 23 and 39 was central to their public personas. And the rural retirement that they built for themselves, literally and figuratively, was most certainly intended to shore up both the lived experience of that romantic friendship and the public persona of their relationship as a romantic friendship.
Despite the firm insistence on the part of the ladies that theirs was a romantic friendship, speculation continued throughout their lives as to the potential sexual nature of that relationship. Friends and family members like Lady Betty, visitors to their home, and of course various journalists and scandalmongers all penned their suspicions, or hopes perhaps, about the true nature of the ladies' love. Some of those representations were harmless, even flattering, like Wordsworth's poem, which substituted their devotion to each other for their devotion to their house. Some were like the General Evening Post, which invited readers to see this relationship as a farce deserving scorn, or perhaps even something dangerous in need of putting down. But everyone who visited the ladies were charmed, and Plas Newida was not just a haven for the ladies. As Patricia Hampel so eloquently put it, quote, Wordsworth and Southey composed poems under its low roof. Both Shelley and Byron turned up to talk and to stare, apparently flummoxed by the orderly cloister life of the ladies. Charles Darwin came as a child in the company of his father. Lady Caroline Lamb, the novelist and lover of Lord Byron, and distant relative of Sarah, made a visit, as did Sir Walter Scott. Even the Duke of Wellington, a treasured friend, and De Quincey, coldly received. On and on the personages of the age made pilgrimage to the isolated Welsh village on the River Dee. Josiah Wedgwood visited the ladies to tour and opine about the rock formations of the surrounding savage landscape. Most visitors stayed a few hours. A few stayed the night at Place Nueda, though the ladies preferred the former if possible, as they valued their quiet nights à deux, tucked up by the fire, reading aloud to each other from French novels. They sent their visitors to the Hand Inn when they weren't feuding with the proprietor, that is, to preserve their evening's peace.
The ladies are fascinating, whether read as the epitome of the romantic female friendship, or as gender-transgressive proto-lesbians, or as something wholly indefinable. They were Irish women who loved women, who fashioned a life together for themselves outside the boundaries of acceptable pathways for women of their ilk and station. Their life seemed kind of awesome by any standard I can imagine. They turned their cottage into a home that they obviously loved. They took pride in the things that their land produced. They took pleasure in being together in a beautiful corner of the United Kingdom. And remarkably, they had their family support, tacitly in allowing them unmolested passage out of Ireland in the first place, but also explicitly with annuities and regular gifts that funded their comfortable little life in Llangollen.
Even though they insisted they were romantic friends, the innuendo of their sexual relationship always threatened to disrupt their domesticity. What consequences awaited them if the townspeople of Llangollen decided their arrangement was morally infectious, like the tribads put on trial in the Netherlands earlier in the 18th century? Were they exceptional in their queer domesticity, or simply exceptional in how well documented their life together was?
The ladies were both known to and contemporaries of Anne Lister and Anne Walker, a couple who had the means to marry in 1834 because Lister inherited her family's estate in West Yorkshire. Lister and Walker's relationship was largely unknown until Lister's coded diaries were discovered at Shibden Hall and later decoded by historian Helena Whitbread. In the U.S., suffragists who set up homes together were so common that the term Boston marriage gained widespread circulation. Like the ladies, Boston marriages were said to be chaste, romantic friendships, but there's enough evidence about some of those Boston marriages to poke holes in that assertion. Mary Burleigh and Margaret Grew, for example, were pretty open about their sharing of home and bed within the suffrage circles. And our own Elizabeth has told us a couple of times about Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, who was the life partner of Susan B. Anthony's niece, Lucy. Transgressive behavior in women, especially elite women, was often the subject of comment, ridicule, or investigation.
As far as we know, the ladies of Llangollen were the only documented 18th or 19th century Irish women who made this kind of life for themselves. That is not to say that there weren't more. We're sure that there were, but we haven't found evidence of them yet. There would be a number of cohabitating and more identifiably sapphic couples involved in the Irish independence movement of the early 20th century, like Madeline French Mullen and Dr. Kathleen Lynn, Elizabeth O'Farrell and Julia Grennan, and Helena Maloney and Evelyn O'Brien. But even their relationships have been relatively obscured and undocumented until very recently with Mary McAuliffe's recent research. Perhaps in a country with declining marriage rates from the 18th century on, the commonality of women setting up homes together, and men as well, meant that they went unnoticed until they made the choice to flee Ireland for Wales. One imagines that the ladies' pastoral escape would have functioned just as well in Ireland, the island of rolling hills and white stone cliffs and thatched roof cottages. But we could see how the public domesticity that they cultivated for themselves, which was really essential to funding their rural retirement, required an escape to rural Wales, where their domesticity might be noticed.
And I think the public persona of this couple is interesting because it's very much like a couple I profile in my book. Michal Macklemore and Hilton Edwards were two Englishmen who effectively fled England to Ireland, where their particular talents, acting, directing, and playwriting, and queer domesticity would be noticed. Macklemore even pretended to be Irish for 50 years, right up until his death. And they lived in a posh part of town, fixed up their terraced house with classical details and exotic furnishings, adopted cats, hosted wild parties, and produced Oscar Wilde's plays. They referred to one another as partner for decades, even in public televised interviews. There's some early evidence in the research I've done that there were lots of confirmed bachelors living together in Ireland throughout the 20th century, just like the revolutionary lesbian couples we just mentioned, but not a ton of Englishmen, or one Englishman and one Englishman pretending to be Irish. There was something intentional about being outsiders who came in, set up a public domesticity, and then funded their life and lifestyle through that public identity.
In many ways, the ladies of Llangollen, Macklemore, and Edwards have given us the gift of visibility. Whatever level of intimacy their relationships took, these were inarguably queer domesticities, challenging the gendered and sexual expectations of their time and places. And because they invited scrutiny and made a spectacle and lived out loud, we have evidence of their queer lives and love. Of course, they all came from positions of immense privilege to begin with, financially, talentedly, hierarchically, which made their invitation of scrutiny and performance of spectacle possible. Their class and status was almost certainly a kind of cushion that allowed them to live out loud.
Most of my work is focused on those who did not have the means or privilege to live out loud. Men who sought anonymous sex in public bathrooms, who were caught and put on trial and imprisoned or lost their jobs. And those men were hard enough to find, buried in vaguely named court records without a finding aid or a roadmap to understanding them. To find the women, when sex between women wasn't criminalized in the same ways as sex between men, it's nearly impossible. There were no gross indecency laws for the Irish police to arrest women under. Undoubtedly, many in the 20th century were confined in Magdalen laundries, worked and beaten and shamed and enslaved to Catholic penance. Those records belong to the church, which unsurprisingly has not relinquished them. So yes, we are fortunate that Ponsonby and Butler not only defied the rules and expectations of their time, but left extensive written records of their affection, their business savvy, and a 51-year life together. Even if they insisted to the last word, carved on a tombstone in a mausoleum shared by these two women and Mary, that they were just friends.
Thank you so very much for joining us today for this delightful, heartwarming cottagecore story. As always, we invite you to follow us on Blue Sky and Instagram at dig_history. If you have a comment or a question, or you want to share some kind words with us, you can always email us at hello@digpodcast.org. We really genuinely love listener mail. If you have a complaint, I want you to put it in a little envelope and then put that little envelope into a fire. If you're an educator, we've got a compendium of episodes that you can use in the classroom and free teaching resources, including full lesson plans on our website, digpodcast.org. And we know that recent changes to curriculum in some states like Florida and Texas will complicate being able to use our podcast episodes. So please reach out to us if there is something that we can do to be helpful to you and your classroom. And get a copy of our book, please. Spiritualism's Place, out now. You can also find full bibliographies, scripts for all of our episodes, resources, link to our swag store, link to all of our co-written and individually written books, including Averil's forthcoming book, Love in the Lav, at our website, digpodcast.org.
Thanks for listening.
Goodbye. Move to Wales.
Bye.
With your beloved.
Yeah, I would love to move to Wales. This podcast was produced by the historians of Dig, Elizabeth Garner Mazurek, Sarah Hanley Cousins, Mercer Rhodes, and me, Avril Earle. Thanks for listening.
They broke into the local gentry scene through friendship with Anne Hill Trevor, oh my God, Anne, no, blah, blah, blah. Most visitors, I'm moving to France. Visitors. Unsurprisingly, Sarah, oh my God.
The class knew, I forgot it already.
No, we did.
Nuida.
And Phyllis, who had belonged to Lady Dungannon, the grandmother of... You've already said that.
Yes, we have.
Okay. We really want you to know that she is the grandmother.
It's important. It's important later. 23 pounds a year and named Plash Nude or Newhall. Actually, we should Google how to pronounce this one.
Yeah, you just made that up.
I sure did.
Welsh is like
Wild.
Butler gave Jeanette ones for her
1
gift.
shilling.
Oh, I'm American. May 24th, 1799. My better half and I went to, oh Christ,
Llantysilio Church.
Llantysilio.
It's the same LL. Llantysilio. Googling it.
Yes. So you know Wales, it's probably pronounced in some like completely different way. That can't be right. Yeah, you were right. Llantysilio.
Llantysilio.
Llantysilio.